Dzień dobry, witam serdecznie. Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Katarzyna Kapitan and I'm postdoctoral researcher at the University of Iceland, where I work on the reception of Old Norse literature in Iceland and Denmark. It is not the reception of Old Norse literature I'm going to talk about today. It is computer-assisted stemmatics, so methods of revealing relationships between texts. Before I start my presentation, I would like to thank Maciej and Artyom for inviting me to join you today, as this topic lies especially close to my heart, as I spent a significant part of my PhD time trying to figure out how the texts of my saga relate to each other. So now I'm going to disappear from your screen and leave you with my voice and my slides. And I hope to see you later at the live discussion. I divided my presentation into three main parts. In the first part, I'll focus on purely theoretical background, so I'll basically tell you where am I coming from and what kind of things in text transmissions are interesting to me. In the second part, I'll focus exclusively on computer-assisted stemmatics as a method which arose from interdisciplinary dialogue between scholars from various disciplines. And the third part focuses on the applications of the computer-assisted stemmatics. So here I'll present some examples how I worked with this method and what are its possibilities and challenges. Basically, the main goal of my presentation today is to introduce you to the method, but also to present the stemma not as a final product of the research, but rather as a point of departure for further analysis. Let's start with the theoretical framework. As the title of my presentation indicates, we're going to operate within the area of textual scholarship today. And the method I'm going to present has its roots in the subdiscipline of textual scholarship called textual criticism. In very brief terms, the objective of textual criticism is to produce a text as close as possible to the authorial original. It has its roots back in the 2nd century BC at the schools of Alexandria and Pergamon. According to the School of Alexandria, the original could be reconstructed by collation of variant readings preserved in corrupted copies. So they use variants to establish the, let's say, correct text. But according to School of Pergamon, on the other hand, the original was not reachable, so they focused on the language of preserved documents. This can resonate to some of you the principles of eclectic editing versus the best text editing. Just as a fast recap, eclectic editing and best text editing are usually associated with two names, Karl Lachmann and Joseph Bedier. And while the first one advocated for the scholarly reconstructions, the second one opted for reproductions of the best text. When I teach scholarly editing and textual criticism, I always ask my students what these two approaches have in common. How do we reconstruct the text? What do we need to reconstruct the text? Well, we need to know the relationships between witnesses, so we need a stemma. But how do we choose the best text then? What do we need? We need a stemma again. So these two approaches share some basic methodology, and this methodology is going to be a subject of my presentation today. Stemmatics is a discipline of textual criticism, or of philology in general, which attempts to reconstruct the transmission of a text preserved in a number of witnesses. The relationships between manuscripts are usually presented in the form of a tree called stemma codicum. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the first stemma ever published from 1827. So if we look at two definitions of stemmatics that I found online, and they are presented on this slide, we can easily observe that the objective of stemmatics are not obvious or not straightforward. So let's read those definitions. The first one, the branch of study concerned with analyzing the relationship of surviving variant version of a text to each other, especially to reconstruct a lost original. And the other one, the humanistic discipline that attempts to reconstruct the transmission of a text on the basis of relations between the various surviving manuscripts. So if we think about the first one, it actually focuses on the reconstruction of a lost original, while the other one focuses on the transmission of the text and the relationships between the manuscripts. So revealing these relationships is the objective of the discipline, and we can leave the lost original to itself. This is the approach which I find very useful in my research, because I'm not necessarily interested in reconstructing any lost archetype, but I'm more interested in a transmission of texts. So on this slide, you can see one of the visualizations of the relationships between texts of the saga I worked with for my PhD. And on the right-hand side, you can see two traditional stemmas, which focus on the oldest and presumably best text of the saga. And on the left-hand side, you can see one of the unrooted stemmas or unrooted trees of relationships I generated while working with this tradition. The previous scholarship, applying traditional rules of textual criticism, focused on determining the best text of the tradition. And that's why scholars examined only 4 to 6 of the oldest manuscripts. My study examined all 30 known texts of the saga and allowed me to ask questions about the transmission history of the texts, such as who, when, and why copied and transformed the text of my saga. Therefore, from the transmission historical point of view, the tree of relationships is only a starting point in further explorations of the tradition. Before I show you some examples of my stemma-based explorations of the tradition, I would like to turn to the method itself in order to give you an insight into the workflow, into its possibilities and limitations. The origins of computer-assisted stemmatics lie in the similarities between stemmatics and evolutionary biology, especially cladistics. Cladistic method is a technique developed in the field of polygenetic systematics, which is a branch of evolutionary biology, which specializes in the reconstruction of the evolutionary tree of life. Cladistic analysis attempts to reconstruct the history of objects that are related in a tree of ancestry and descent. It observes the organisms in their current form and tries to reconstruct relationships between them, applying a rule of parsimony. The similarities between cladistics and stemmatics have been first observed in 1977 by Norman Platnick and Don Cameron, who pointed out that cladistic method is applicable in all studies of historical interrelationships, which are based on ancestor-descendant sequence. This idea has been extensively explored by various scholars. Dutch scholars such as Ben Salemans and Margrethe van Mulken applied cladistic method in what they called cladistic textual criticism, while, for example, Peter Robinson and Robert O'Hara applied it in what they call new stemmatics. And on this slide, I've presented just some of the important publications in English where new stemmatic approaches to textual traditions are presented. I would also like to bring to your attention the newest publication in the field of stemmatology, which came out just this September, I think, which has actually 2 chapters very relevant for computer-assisted methods and this interdisciplinary approach concerning similarities between evolutionary biology and textual criticism or literary traditions. There has been a fair deal of discussion as to what data should be used to generate stemmas. This is the same discussion that we have in traditional non-computer-based textual criticism. Which variants can be used? Which variants are informative for revealing relationships between manuscripts? And the same considerations are raised when we're talking about auto-generating stemmas or those trees of relationships. And generally, the followers of new stemmatics disagree with the followers of cladistic textual criticism. But the main common features of computer-assisted stemmatics in general are the following. The analysis aims to obtain a comprehensive overview of the relations among all the witnesses. The analysis employs quantitative tools, typically computer-based, and it builds on cladistics and the principle of parsimony. The parsimony principle in science requires to choose the simplest scientific explanation. So in terms of tree building, the best hypothesis is the one that requires the fewest changes. There are many programs available on the market which can be used to conduct computer-assisted stemmatic analysis. I am working with PHYLIP-package, which was first released in 1980, and it is still maintained and developed. It contains 3 programs that I regularly use: Parse, Consense, and Drawtree. And I chose this package because it is open source, easy to use, and it has been successfully applied to Old Norse tradition by Alaric Hall and Caitlin Parsons in their study of Konrad's saga, the Keisarasöner. In order to conduct computer-assisted stemmatic analysis, we need our textual tradition to be converted into computer-friendly numeric format. Therefore, the process of data collection is a bit different than traditionally. During my PhD, I followed the workflow applied by Alaric Hall in his study. So first on the data collection level, the researcher has to manually transcribe all the texts into the Excel spreadsheet, and then the numeric values which represent variation have to be manually assigned to all the readings. And finally, these numbers have to be converted into the TXT format, which can be read by PHYLIP-package. I found this method very time-consuming and easy to generate errors. A human being manually putting in the numbers into a spreadsheet, it's not very effective, and for sure, it's not especially consistent, and I've learned it the hard way. Also, transcribing 30 texts into the spreadsheet is repetitive, especially when the same reading appears in 25 of 30 manuscripts and the same number has to be assigned to all of them. This method is even more time-consuming if one wants to distinguish between minor variants and major variants, because then one has to encode all the variants twice. You have to have one spreadsheet with major variants and then another spreadsheet with major and minor variants so you can compare the results. I was interested in simplifying the whole process to limit the repetitive tasks to minimum and to let computer do what it is good at, so at converting my readings into numbers. I have conducted some experiments aimed at developing an alternative workflow to the one proposed by Alaric. Instead of transcribing all the text into an Excel spreadsheet, I use TI XML encoding. The process of preparing an auto-generated stemma starts with the TI XML-based transcription of the base text. All variant readings are encoded in APP element, which is apparatus element. This is chapter 12, I think, of TEI guidelines. And this element can include lemma element, LEM, and reading element, RDG. Lemma will contain the main reading or the reading of the base text, while the reading element will contain the variant readings. And both lemma and reading have to contain a witness attribute where we specify which manuscripts preserve the selected readings. So the text where no textual variation appears is transcribed only once, and it saves a lot of time. The second step is the Python transformation, which replaces the process of assigning numeric values manually to the variant readings in the spreadsheet. So my custom Python script extracts information encoded in the XML file and transforms it into a TXT file. This TXT file will then be used as an input file for Parse, one of the programs included in the PHYLIP-package. So Parse requires the numeric values which represent the shared readings. This corresponds to the DNA sequences which Parse was designed to analyze. So what my script does, it goes to each apparatus element in our XML file, checks how many children it has, and then assigns the same numeric values to each witness that preserves the same reading. And as an output, it generates a file that can be used as an input for Parse. The rest of the process is basically the same as in the case of Alaric's workflow. So the next step is parse processing, when the output from our Python transformation is used as an input file for parse. And then it generates an output file which includes the information about the most parsimonious trees of relationships. And this output file can be used as an input for the visualization software. So the last step is the visualization and interpretation of the data. The output from Parse is used as an input for another program included in PHYLIP-package, this time Draw-Tree. And this one is used to obtain the visualization of the unrooted tree of relationships. This can be saved in any format, PostScript or JPEG or whatever. So, like, the final result of the application of my workflow is obviously the same as if we followed Hall's workflow. We end up with an unrooted tree of relationships which needs to be manually evaluated by the researcher. I believe, however, that there are some advantages of following my workflow. First of all, the possibility of human error is minimalized. I mean, if we don't make obvious mistakes in our transcription, then the numeric values will be consistently assigned. The encoding work is less repetitive. We don't need to transcribe the same passage number of times. The stemma can be a part of a digital edition, and this gives the user a possibility to check the underlying data and evaluate our conclusions about the relationships among the manuscripts. The main difference lies in the fact that XML prepared data can be reused a countless number of times applying different criteria, without any need of re-encoding of all the information again. This feature is not fully implemented yet, but I hope I will be able to add it to my script soon. How I imagine it ideally is that if we would use in our XML-based transcription type attribute on each of our app elements, we could distinguish between different types of variants, let's say major variants, minor variants, and orthographic variants if we even wanted. And then by running a single script, we can obtain different trees of relationships to each type of variation, and then evaluate which distribution is the most accurate or perhaps most useful for our research. We could also decide to encode the major variants and run a sequential analysis of the variation, which prepares stemmas for each chapter or each specified chunk of text. And this might be a helpful method of identifying the contamination in the tradition. There are, however, some limitations, and some of them originate from the nature of TI XML. The preparation of XML-based transcription is time-consuming, and the bigger the number of witnesses, the encoding becomes less and less human-readable. It's just impossible to see what's happening. There are also limitations of my script, as for now it works only with a tradition up to 26 witnesses. It is sufficient for small traditions, but it should be expanded. And the script just needs to be modified, and I haven't done it even though I've been sitting on it for quite some time. And finally, there are some limitations of PHYLIP-package, which I cannot influence. The program runs only on the traditions with up to 8 readings per character. So in TI XML terminology, we can only have up to 8 children of apparatus element. And this is not a problem in experiments I run on major variants of Hromundar saga, but it starts to be a problem when we want to look at minor variants and forgetting about orthographic variants. There is orthographic variation in every single manuscript. Anyway, those were the methodological consideration, and now I would like to present some clear examples of the use of stemma as an exploratory tool of a textual tradition. And I will use as a case examples from my study of Hromundar saga to show you how my own research benefited from the application of this method. So you've seen this slide before. You can see visualizations of various stemmas, right? So we have traditional stemmas of Hromundar saga that visualize relationships between oldest manuscripts. And then we have my unrooted tree, or one of my unrooted trees, which actually illustrates relationships between all the known texts of the saga. So it's a clear difference also in the objective of the research. I'm not interested in reconstructing anything. I'm interested in a change in the process of transformation of a text. So we can just zoom in at one part of this unrooted stemma. Here you can see a group of manuscripts which are marked with green triangles, and they all seem to be derived from some common ancestor, which I marked on this slide with a green circle. This common ancestor of the group is closely related to 2 texts preserved in manuscripts, to which I refer to as A587 and A193. They are marked with a green star here, and their sigla are illegible because they are overlapping in this visualization. Their texts are basically identical. So what I must mention here is that the tree you see on this slide was built exclusively on the transcriptions of texts preserved in manuscript form. So none of the additions was included in the dataset. Hromundar saga, however, has been edited twice. Once by Erik Julius Björner in 1737, and second time by Carl Christian Rapp in 1829. We know that Rapp's edition was based on A587, so on our green star manuscript. Therefore, we can place a hypothesis that all those 5 green triangle manuscripts are actually derived from Rapp's edition. As you can see on this slide, they all postdate the publication of Rapp's edition in 1829. So at least chronologically, they can be derived from the printed edition. A closer analysis of this group shows that these manuscripts are the only ones that reproduce the major error of the edition, which is in regard to the name of one of the characters. They called one of the characters Laura instead of Kaura. Moreover, all these manuscripts preserve the saga, which is divided into 10 chapters, a feature which was introduced to Hromundar saga tradition by Björner and which was reproduced also in Rapp's edition. Now, why is it important? Well, it allows us to look at this group of manuscripts as derived from the printed edition. And we can ask further questions about this scribal practice in Iceland at the beginning of the 19th century. This delivers especially interesting results when we compare this group to one other subgroup of texts of Hromundar saga. If we zoom into the lower part of the unrooted tree, we will see two manuscripts which appear to be derived from P67. Those are M936, written in Germany in the first half of the 19th century, and Axoria 61, written in Denmark also in the first half of the 19th century. So what is interesting is that P67, from which these two manuscripts are supposed to be derived, was in a Swedish collection from the late 17th century, and no other known manuscript preserving Hromundar saga appears to be derived from it. So how all of the sudden in the 19th century someone in Denmark and someone else in Germany transcribed texts of Hromundar saga, which are so similar that from the text critical point of view, they're almost identical. That's why their sigla are overlapping on this visualization. Well, the answer lies again in the printed edition. This time is Björner's edition, published in 1737. Björner published his edition in Sweden, and not surprisingly, he based his text on the only manuscript of Hromundar saga that was available to him in a Swedish repository. It was P67. It's Stockholm manuscript paper folio number 67. He reproduced the text of P67 fairly reliably, with only few minor errors, which made their way into both Accessoria 61 and AM936, revealing their clear dependence on the edition. This creates a fascinating case study of manuscripts that preserve texts derived from printed editions. We have 5 Icelandic manuscripts from the 19th century, which are based on Rapp's edition. And there are 2 manuscripts, one Danish and one German, from the 19th century, which are based on Björner's edition. This allows us to ask questions as how the scribes treated the text of the edition. Did the printed text have any authority over a handwritten one? Meaning, did the scribes copy the printed text more reliably than when they copied from another manuscript? What kind of changes, if any, were introduced to the texts? Since we don't have much time left, I'm not going to go into detail with my findings, but in general we can say that the texts written by non-Icelanders were much more reliable to their sources than the texts copied by Icelanders. The variation in non-Icelandic manuscripts is only on a word level, involving misreadings of certain characters, while the variation in Icelandic manuscripts involves rewriting, adding, and deleting whole sentences. Also, the manuscript context in which Hromundar saga appears is quite different between these two groups. While in Icelandic manuscripts it appears with various sagas, sagas of Icelanders, legendary sagas, and romances, in the non-Icelandic manuscripts, Hromundar saga actually appears exclusively with other legendary sagas. And moreover, they preserve them in more or less the same order in which they appeared in the printed edition. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show you more examples where looking at the unrooted tree has led me to interesting discoveries of Hromundar's saga tradition. But to sum up my presentation today, I would like to point three clearest advantages of the application of this method. In my view, the automatization of the process of variant collation and calculation of distances among texts makes the whole process much easier than it was before. So what used to take years to manually collate and evaluate variants now can be done significantly faster. This allows us to use time for actual interpretation of variants in broader context, and it allows us to ask further questions about textual transmission. The use of computer to convert the readings into numbers and to calculate the distances minimalizes the chances for human errors, and it also minimalizes the inconsistencies in data collection, something that was very clear in my spreadsheets when I was assigning all the values manually. Using Python just helped me to get rid of those inconsistencies. And finally, if we choose the XML-based way of collecting our data, with only one click we can generate an addition with extensive variant apparatus. The information which is necessary to build a tree is already encoded in our addition, so the unrooted trees can be generated using various criteria on the fly. And this makes our research not only reproducible, but it also gives the user of our digital edition possibility to explore the textual tradition in his or her own way, making the edition itself a research tool. That's all what I have today. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found it interesting. And I'm looking forward to your questions in the live session. Thanks a lot.